Good morning. I'm Gertrude Howe. I was born in 1921, and I was the last of 5 children. My dad owned a farm on Rural Route 3, Hickory Beach, although at that time it was called Rural Route 3, Finland Falls, and near Sturgeon Lake, 200 yards from Sturgeon Lake. There were cottages along the shoreline, but my dad had a 100-acre farm, and the top half was gravel and the second half was loam. So we had good feedback for the back lots with their for vegetables and grain and that sort of thing. And the front was eventually done into a gravel pit. And but not in Dad's time. Dad didn't like to save the old style of the farm. He wouldn't have the gravel dug up in his time. For the farm life, I would say that we never felt poor. I didn't know what poor meant. We had everything we wanted to eat, and enough of it. And I didn't know until I got to Toronto and saw the way other people lived, what we had been missing. But through the years, I grew up too. I'd get on a streetcar and I'd be going the wrong direction. I'd spot a sign on the highway and see that I was going the wrong way, and I'd get off and go across the street and go the opposite way, and I'd find my way, because I had no introduction into Toronto at all, just what I found out myself. But and then I lived in Toronto. Of course, de Havilland was just outside, and we lived there for the years that Laurie worked at de Havilland Airport. The plane, when we get back, he worked at de Havilland when we were married, and maybe for 2 years after de Havilland. And they had the big plane, Mosquito was first built at de Havilland, and when it was having its first run up to see how adequate it was and so on, the pilot offered him to go with him to try it out. But in the morning, for some reason, the person that took him to work, was a couple of minutes late, so the plane was just spurring when he got to de Havilland. And they watched it as it burst into flames and came down, and the pilot was killed and the plane completely destroyed, naturally. And so he felt very badly about that, but it was one of those things. And he worked in an experimental shop there, and he did something in the experimental shop that put a couple of programs into one program, which saved them a lot of money, and put it in the box, that they put each month to see if there's anything to improve on the place where you work. And they sent him back a check for $200, which was an awful lot of money back then for the experiment. And they kept him in the experimental shop from then until he finished working at de Havilland a couple of years later when it quit. And my brother drove one of the planes. He was I called him a dotted-it man, but he did all the paperwork to tell them we're over the target, now is the time, 10 minutes, now is the time, let go, and they bomb out a section and all this sort of thing. He was in that for years. And he came home with that plane, he and his crew got permission to bring it home. But he was quite sick when he came home with kidney problems and other things from being so long in the war. And I had 2 brothers in the war, but Harry went over, he got on the cleanup deal for the war as well. But anyway, we all left home, each one. Well, I was the youngest, so I was the last one to leave. And I came to Toronto in 19, That was 1921, 31, 34. I went to Toronto to work because we all had to go to work right after public school. By law, you had to go to school until you got public school, and then we were free. So Dad warned us all that we wouldn't be going to high school. We had to make our own living after that, so we knew what was coming. And I went with a lady from our shoreline who was very good to me and taught me many, many things that I sure appreciated her doing and told her about it later. So in the morning, Mrs. Appleton took me down to Eaton's, and I had never been in Toronto before. But anyway, I just followed her and did just fine. And I got back home and she got me blue outfits for a dress and white apron, a coverall apron. It came around and tied in front, but a full apron. And then at noon, after lunch, I could have an hour's rest. And then I went back and put one on for dinner time, which was all black. And it had a black and white frilled hat that tied under my chin. And I served dinner that way in a dining room. And it was very odd to me. I had never even seen silver before. I had never seen a refrigerator before. And she had a new one. Oh, that was really something. To have all the fruit on the top of the refrigerator. And I must say I gained 10 pounds in that first 3 months I was in Toronto. I was a very skinny girl. After my son was born in Toronto, we rented a house near Finland, and I lived there with an old car that I could get to my mother and dad's. And I lived there alone with him for a year. And then the three Howe families bought a farm in Garden Hill, which is near Millbrook. So we lived there for 3 years. And my husband got a tractor through the bank to pay back each month and so on. And he plowed fields and never did anything like that in his life before, but he did. And he was also legally blind. My husband was born that way. So it was quite a struggle for everything that he did. Sadly, I lost my son when he was 58. He was perfectly fine, healthy man, but he took cancer of the bone marrow. And you deteriorate from the inside of the bone right out to the shell. And he was 3 years terribly sick. And he was president of a company in Bell, Canada at that time. Had gone all through, and he had taken a year's, ahead of time, he'd taken a year's sabbatical, and then he took sick. But at that time, he went into doing outhouse, like patios, all that sort of thing for people that wanted extras put on their houses, and did that, got into the carpentry. And his father was a wonderful man. He taught his son just about everything there was to teach in the way of carpentry. And he came down and got us started on our new house. Oh, let's see, where should I go from there? I was brought up in the Salvation Army. My dad was a bass player there for 50 years. And so everything we had done was pertaining to the Salvation Army. And in the summer times, we would go on trips on the boat. And it was steam boats, then launches, big launches. And the band would go along the top rail and play their hymns all the way down the valley, down to through Bobcaygeon and out into Sturgeon Lake, and then over to just down past Bobcaygeon and on the shoreline of Pigeon Lake. You don't remember?
Curve Lake. Curve Lake?
Curve Lake, yes. We'd go down, and sometimes we would be invited on shore, and they had all kinds of baskets and all kinds of things that were woven by hand, and we could buy them. And it was a very exciting day for us because we got to so few things. But the whole family would be there all day long, and then they would come back, and we had docks along Sturgeon Lake that were deep enough for him to come into the dock, and we unloaded just 200 yards from our house. The Lintonia would hire a band, and they would come and play on the Lintonia, and they'd have dances out on the lake in the middle of the night. And really, that was my highlight. Think of something like that. So let's see, from then on, first of all, Dad had an all-round farm. He didn't specialize in anything. We had all the regulars, horses and cows and pigs and everything you can think of. And we had all kinds of vegetables. And as the tourists grew along the shoreline, they used to come up to buy our vegetables, and my sister and I would go around and carry our cucumbers and so on by pails and sell to them along the shoreline. 25 cents for a cucumber, and most were nickel. And we'd go home, boy, if we ever had $1, that was really something. And then, let's see, from then on, we gradually grew up. My dad was an ice man. There were several around Fenelon Falls. I believe Jackets were one, and I think Thurstonia's over in Thurstonia had an outlet there. My dad would run our field and then go across and do the Thurston field and fill their place with ice. And this means hundreds and hundreds of blocks of 24-inch square ice. And then from there he'd go to Sturgeon Point. And gradually Jackets came down from Fenelon and would do most of that later on in the season. But it was very interesting because the field would be cut like 24 inches square, and they were done in lines, like you'd put a line for a roof to make sure you had a straight line coming up for a roof. You do the same kind of line, 24 inches, and they were all marked, and he had all the equipment, of course, for the ice saws and the things that pull the ice out, and you know, everything that was going for ice fields. And we always had all the men for dinner. So my sister and I would go back, after watching them for a while, we'd go back and help Mother get things ready for dinner. And they always had at least 3 teams of horses, and would go to the ice houses, and you'd get a fresh load of manure for each setting, and you'd put a whole layer of the 24 inches fairly close together with sawdust between every 24 inches. And then you'd layer that over the top and then go for another route. And this ice house would be about 24 feet each way, north and south and east and west. And they'd go until they got it up maybe 11 stories high. And so they used to have to get the top layer off with a ladder to take the first layer in the spring. You'd take 1 block in to the house because they all had to be washed, and the cedar, everything taken off of them, sawdust. And that would be cut in 4, and then through the middle would be quite a lot of blocks up from 1 block anyway. But it was hard work, heavy work. The men had to do that. And Dad had a T-model car that he made into a truck back, and they were all loaded on the truck. and he delivered ice to the cottagers 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday, I think it was, something like that, and to give them cold food for the weekend, because I don't think at that time there was any refrigerators even in Toronto. Dad did it for many years, and then he took a bad heart and he couldn't crank the car to start the engine, so he always had to have somebody with him to crank the car and get it started to take away, and then he'd leave it running all the time he went into the places with the ice. He was cutting ice, and somebody had cut down through the ice, but not all the way, and he didn't know that it wasn't cut all the way, or I don't know just how that worked out. Anyway, he figured he could walk on it, and he backed up onto this chunk of ice, and it flipped over and put him in the lake. And they got him out. The men got him out with they have nets, everything to work with, and we got him on the wagon, and we all went into the house that the place would hold, and took all the glue off of his socks and so on to get his shoes off, and he was soaked in ice all over. His whole body was soaked in ice. But we got it off of him, and he lived. He had to stay in bed for a day or two, but he came through it all fine. But the hardships back then are hard to believe now when you see things so free now. My dad had a team and two teams and horses, wagons, and the boat would come into the dock just down below us, and he would be there with the horses and the wagon, and usually two, I think, at a time, and they'd load the bricks. At that time, the bricks were not made any closer than Lindsay. There were no bricks made around here. And they'd load them in Lindsay from the brickyard onto this boat, take them from the boat onto the trailer, and my dad would take the trailer and the horses and go 3 miles to where the schoolhouse was and unload them there for the men to put on the school the next day. Now, Dad was would do that every day until the whole school was built. So it is built still with those same bricks that he took up by a boat, by wagon. Let me in at 5 because I was the last one, and we'd go through the fields in the winter. We'd cut across all the fields because ice would be right up over the top railing, and I'd be the last one of 8 going. Our neighbors as well. And so there was only 1 year that I was in school with my brother, my oldest brother. And then he got expelled when he was 12, just before his was to graduate, because they had a baseball team, and he pumped water for all the other kids, and they all got their drink. And then he went to have one for himself, and the teacher wouldn't let him have it. And he said, I pumped all the water for all those kids, and I'm going to have a drink. And he took a drink of water, and he was expelled from school. The trustees all got together and expelled him from school. So he never did go back to school. So he never got his grade 4th, but they allowed him to stay out of school. But that school has just been resold, I believe, into a home. And it's quite something they can do with those schools to make into a home. You know what they're like, a girl's entrance and a boy's entrance, and the room in between the two was a teacher's room. And the teacher's own place, she locked it all the time. It was locked. But sometimes we would only have, maybe 15 in the school, for the whole school, 8 grades, we're all in one school. There's no side room, no side house or anything. It was all together. So whatever grade 1 could hear what grade 8 were doing and learn what you could. And but I got through school just fine. My sister did not, because she had, which is sad when you think of today's way of living, but she had the war brought back a flu that killed millions of people. The First World War brought back a lot of people, and that I had an uncle who died, just got back from the war and died at home with the flu from the war. And anyway, my sister took it from him, and she was just learning to walk, and she just rocked in a rocking chair for 2 years after that, but she gradually got back on her feet and learned to walk. But she was a little quiet, we'll say, but it was hard for her to go to school, and she had no help. And when she'd go to school, the teacher said, I can't teach 8th grades and teach you too, so you have to learn whatever you can in school. And she said, I suggest you bring your dad's socks and we'll darn them during the day. So she had 8 years of darning socks in school, never was taught a single thing. And if she ever fidgeted with anything, she got that with a ruler across her hands. If that was today, it wouldn't be, would it? The Blythe schoolhouse was built on my grandfather's farm, and he donated 2 acres or whatever it took for a school. Then off the corner of his farm, right on the highway, and Sturgeon Point Road and the highway, right on the corner, he donated that land to the community to build a school. So it's really quite a part of me in generations to come, to think that I was on my grandfather's farm. And he had that farm and grew his family on that farm, and until they all married and went different places, different houses. We had no hydro, and we had no bathrooms. It was out in the outhouse in the wintertime, no matter how cold it was. And I think I was in Toronto maybe 5 years when Dad had the electric put in, but they never did get a bathroom. But then we built them the new house, and they had it all in the new house on the corner of the farm. We had some beautiful scenery in that farm. We had the most beautiful pine bush, and it's still there. A lot has blown down, but during Hurricane Hazel, if you remember that at all, they came and 100 trees went down in Dad's farm, and it uprooted the roots, and everything were laying flat, and the trees were laying on the ground. And my husband and my dad cut them all by handsaw, back and forth with a handsaw. There were no electric saws then. And got the logs all cut, and we got them to the road with the horses. And then we had a truck come down from town and take it into Hanley's and have it made into lumber. And that's what my husband and my first house was out of, was the lumber from that storm. And we were 2 or 3 years getting the house. Well, we were 6 months till we moved in, and then we worked on it after we moved in. You can't see butternut trees hardly ever anymore. If you find one, try and get a sprig off of it. It was a very tall tree, and they came down in clumps. There would be one stem with several sprouts off of it with the butternuts all clinging to it. So sometimes you'd get a fistful when you'd get one chunk down, but he kept doing it, and he had somebody on the bottom picking up as he dropped them so that the squirrels wouldn't get it. They just loved the butternuts. But they weren't any good for us until they dried during the winter, and in the spring, then they were ready to eat. About Easter time, that we nearly always spent Easter Sunday if we could find a stone and break it apart with another stone and really enjoyed. They were just really to us like a butternut. But we each had a basket. In the spring, Dad would get a basket for each one of us. And we'd spend all Sunday doing that. And in the meantime, by then I had the second child. So we had a full life. My husband worked as a plumber at Sturgeon Point for Favel, and his son, Prince Edward, was it? Yeah, his son. And they had bathrooms and bathrooms, like I think Sir Joseph's house had 14 bathrooms, but all had to be drained in the fall and put on in the spring, and he was their handyman, sort of, there for a while. And then we went into business for ourselves and managed just fine through the years. And that was my life, so, not too much to say about that. But it was a good time.